Hi there, I'm Don Kettl, and I'm a professor of public affairs at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin. And with us today for a conversation is Philip Howard, who's a noted attorney, but also a best-selling author. Among other things, we have his book, The Rule of Nobody, and a whole variety of other things that he's talked about. But I wanted to pull this one off the shelf today because I wanted to begin by introducing him by reading what Jon Stewart from The Daily Show back in the old days had to say about him in the book. That Philip K. Howard has always struck me as an eminently reasonable, articulate advocate for common sense solutions. No wonder nobody listens to him. And so what we want to do today is have a chance to be able to listen to him and what it is that he says. And one of the things that he's saying these days is that we need, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, what he calls a spring cleaning commission. And Mr. Howard, what do you have in mind for this commission? And what is it that he needs to be cleaned up?
Well, you know, the regulatory statutory codes of the United States aren't actually codes. If you actually go look at them, they're more like a junk pile. It's things that have accreted more or less over the last 50 years, since the 1970s. And nobody's gone back and take a look and see, well, what works and what doesn't. Does it make sense to have subsidies for farmers? You know, when no farmers are subsidized, does it make sense to require every lab to go through the eye of the Washington needle in order to test for COVID-19 when it's an emergency? You know, that sort of thing. And nobody's gone and done a serious look at it. And whereas European countries, at least from time to time, go back and try to make sense of their codes.
Yeah, one of the things that has always struck me is that every single one of these things exists for what somebody once upon a time thought was a good reason. But as you point out, we never go back to ask whether or not that good reason still exists.
Well, and also, that's right. And no one really looks at the practical consequences of them. I'll just give a story. Tree falls in a creek in New Jersey, causes flooding. The mayor sends in a backhoe to pull the tree out of the creek. And the town lawyer says, well, that's a Class C1 creek. You need official approval to pull a natural object out of a Class C1 creek. So it takes them 12 days and $10,000 in legal fees to get approval to do something that's completely obvious. Well, a version of that happened with COVID-19. You know, people knew it had come to Seattle, they wanted to test for it, and they had to wait for weeks until Washington gave them permission.
And one of the things that is just fascinating about the kind of argument that you're making is that it's a combination of two things. One is a series of individual decisions which on their own just don't make sense. That's the problem, this rule of nobody, as you talk about, and another book that you've written, The Death of Common Sense, that one of the problems with government is it's really plagued by these sets of individual decisions that, as you explain these stories, just don't make sense. But then we have a government system where all these things get layered on top of each other. And so what do you think that does to us in our ability to be able to make government work for ordinary citizens?
Well, it has a number of effects. First of all, it's paralytic. So at this point, the pile is so high, it's 150 million words in federal government alone, not counting state and local government. So governments, if you really tried to comply with all the rules, you couldn't do it. It's like a melted circuit board. You know, you're always going to conflict. So one of the reasons why infrastructure approvals can take a decade is that the rules from the Fish and Wildlife Department conflict with the rules from the Corps of Engineers, and neither will budge. So years go on as they have this fight, you know. So, you know, you need to have well, ultimately, I think the system is built on a flawed premise, which is to replace human judgment. Whereas what I argue in The Rule of Nobody is that law always requires application, like the constitutional principles of free speech or no unreasonable searches and seizures. They don't execute themselves. It requires people of good faith to make judgments and then other people to hold them accountable. And we've tried to create a system of 1,000-page rule books and detailed processes designed to protect against any human mistake. And the effect is to prevent any human success.
And the question is, if we need to sweep away some of these obsolete rules and some of these things that have built up over time, where are we going to find the broom? I mean, what kind of process do you think we're likely to use, since there are vested interests that are gathered around every single one of these rules and regulations and programs? I mean, how can we find a broom to sweep the things away that you think are really clogging up the system?
Yeah, one of the reasons why reform always fails is because there are always special interests who want to keep something, right? Even Washington has 15,000 different special interests, all dedicated to the status quo in their particular area. So the only way change ever really happens is in big gulps. Brian Jones at the University of Texas writes about this, sort of it's called punctuated equilibrium. And when it comes to codes, it generally happens with recodification commissions. So you change, you create in this case, a simplified code that sort of affects everything in an area so that people see both the wins and losses. Whereas if you just try to change one thing, it may be a win for somebody, but a loss for another. Whereas if you change everything, let's say in the area of infrastructure approvals or in the area of oversight for pandemics or something, if you change everything, then people can see where there are advantages as well as disadvantages. Last time we did that in this country was really with the Uniform Commercial Code in the 1950s, where we, a small committee led by Carl Llewellyn came up with this set of principles for a commercial code that got adopted by most of the then 48 states. And it's sort of the basis for commerce, interstate commerce, because everybody can apply the same rules.
Is this really an argument of trying to switch from rules on the one side to outcomes on the other? Is that what's at the core of all this?
That's a lot of it. I mean, their rules are still important in areas where reasonableness doesn't work. You can't have a reasonable amount of pollution, so you probably need effluent guidelines. On the other hand, if you're running a classroom, or for that matter, running a hospital, you're constantly having to make trade-offs. Do you pay attention to this child or that child, to this patient or that patient? And in those, what are known as complex situations, as opposed to complicated, which are detailed, in complex situations, you really need simple codes that are more outcome-oriented and principle-oriented.
One of the things that enormously complicates, to pick up on what you just said, complicates this debate is our increasing reliance on nonprofit organizations and government contractors. I mean, how has that growth tended to complicate the kind of debate that you're talking about?
Well, I think it's natural that government has tried to outsource things to not-for-profits. I think there's some very effective ones, but the contracting process itself is quite bureaucratic, right, and rigid. So that's one of the areas that needs to get reshaped. I worked on procurement reform during the Al Gore Reinventing Government initiative, and government can pay 2 or 3 times as much as for the same product that would cost in the private sector because of all the rigidities in the process.
And as you try to sweep some of that away, what in particular would you do to try to reform and improve that contracting process dealing with both nonprofits, mostly for social services, and the vast array of the rest of the contracting system?
I would go to an outcomes-based program, and because of distrust drives all these rules. Distrust drives all these rigid procedures. Everybody's afraid that somebody's going to give a favor or get away with murder and all this sort of stuff. So it's really important to have checks and balances and accountability mechanisms that people trust. So one of the things they did in England under Cameron, a guy named Francis Maude, Lord Maude, sort of led this, is they created a kind of a business oversight model where they actually had, depending on the contract, a sort of approval basis from people who were experts in an area on the reasonableness of the contract and could go back and actually opine on how the contract worked.
And so the key here is, as we've been discussing, focusing on trying to create a process that works, but a process that works in terms of trying to produce the outcome that you want with as few hurdles that you have to jump through in the meantime. And that's really the core of your argument here, I think. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, what matters is whether the school is effective and whether you can deal with the pandemic immediately and on a real-time basis instead of sitting on your hands for 3 weeks or whatever. And you can safeguard against bad decisions or mistakes with clear lines of accountability, with checks and balances where there's time for that. I've argued to the head of the teachers union, for example, that that bad teachers are not good for teachers, right? They're not good for students, but they're also not good for teachers. So why not replace these impossible due process hearings that prevent anybody from ever getting rid of anybody with a site-based parent-teacher committee with the power to veto decisions? So are you worried about an abusive principal? Great. There's this committee that can overturn its decisions right there. And instead of having these, legal hearings that can cost $500,000.
And what you're really talking about is transforming accountability by transforming the way the governance works, by sharing authority more broadly and bringing citizens in a different kind of way, and using that to replace the kind of processes that have, as you point out, built up over the last 20, 50, 100 or more years.
Right. It's really, I argue in the rule of nobody, it's really the last 50 years. There were all these abuses in the 1960s that really were abuses: racism, pollution, lies about Vietnam. So the traditional American distrust of government went into hyperspeed. And so we decided to create an operating framework, I'll call it, of detailed rules and procedures. We never had 1,000-page rule books before the 1970s. That was an invention of, coming out of the 60s. We didn't have hearings every time a unruly student got, dismissed from a classroom. And it's a profoundly anti-human system. We wanted to protect against all mistakes, so we took away human judgment and tried to replace it with detailed rules and procedures. And, the evidence is in COVID-19, it's just a tragic example of it. It doesn't work. It doesn't let people, use their hands to solve a problem in front of them.
And with the last few minutes that we've got, I want to talk about what it is you think we've learned, or at least should learn, from this COVID-19 case. What does it tell us about some of the underlying pathologies of government, and what kind of opportunities does it create for trying to rethink the way that governance ought to operate?
Oh, I think there are all these lessons to be learned. Well, first of all, the unbelievable ability of humans to lose sight of the goal into mindless adherence to rules. I mean, Hume once said, people are mightily addicted to rules. It's just unbelievable. It's like people go brain dead. Gogol wrote about it, and Kafka, and so people are sitting there, this incredibly virulent virus is spreading, and they're sitting, waiting for weeks, deciding whether to approve a certain lab to test it, even though it's been approved for other things. It's just unbelievable. What are they thinking? There's actually a body of psychology called cognitive load theory that talks about what happens when you give a working memory complicated things to keep in mind. It actually shuts the door. It freezes the subconscious. What's right and wrong. Instinct. So we learn from that. Secondly, coming out of COVID, the fact that they've thrown the rule books away. Nothing that they're doing to solve COVID, opening up new hospitals, doing telemedicine, reusing equipment, everything they're doing violates the rules. Everything they're doing to solve the problems violates the rules. So what does that tell you about the rules?
And so what does that tell us ultimately about what the either new rules or new governance system ought to be coming out of this?
It ought to be an adaptable, goal-oriented system where you can identify people who have responsibility, you can identify the people who have responsibility to hold them accountable or check and balance their decisions. You go back to a system that our framers intended, which is a democratic system with clear lines of authority and accountability, and judge how people do, but don't try to take away from them the ability to solve problems. Life is too complex for central planning. I mean, the system we've created is a form of central planning, except it's worse because the planners are all dead. Some guy who wrote a rule in 1981. And then there's another rule written in 85, and they all get piled on top of each other. It's really crazy.
And then they run it through legacy computer systems that nobody knows how to fix because nobody's alive and knows how to program them.
I love it. You know, New Jersey advertising for COBOL programmers. I mean, pretty soon they'll be advertising for people who do punch cards. I mean, it's really just astonishing.
One of the things, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that this is a series of videos that we are doing for students. And one of the challenges is trying to explain what a punch card is, because most of our students have never seen them, let alone know what it is or why they might be important.
Oh my God. I mean, it's really, I mean, this casts such a harsh light on government. Really is time for a spring cleaning. And it needs to be done by independent commissions. You and I should run it, definitely. so we can appoint ourselves to do it. And you know something? It's not hard, because when you go to goals, people don't actually disagree about goals, by and large.
And it's one of those things, as you suggest, we know what we need to do. The question is how best to try to find a way to get there. And that's one of the things I know that you want to try to accomplish with the Spring Cleaning Commission that you're proposing.
Yeah, that's right. And so we're going to try, the first effort is to build sort of public support for the idea so that it can get into the 2020 debates. Because it's only when the candidates debate it that people will know what they're talking about when they come into office and do it, you know, and have a chance to do it. So we need to raise the public profile of the idea of cleaning out government. And it's really important. Everybody's stuck in this mode of deregulation versus more regulation. What we're talking about is not deregulation, it's re-regulation. It's making it so that government is effective without suffocating everybody in their daily choices.
Terrific. Well, this is a conversation that surely is going to be going on for a very long time, but it's an effort to try to reset it. Phil Howard, the author of The Rule of Nobody, as well as a number of other great books. Thanks so much for being with us today. I'm really grateful to you for your thoughts and for your comments and for stimulating such a fascinating discussion here about what the future of governance ought to look like.
Great to be with you, Don.